the doctor handed Selena's baby to me, not to Benny, to me. And Benny walked through that door 30 seconds later. I was standing there with a newborn in my arms, and Benny was standing in the doorway, and Selena was on the bed looking at me, and nobody in that room said a single word for what felt like the longest moment of my life. That was 4 weeks ago, and I have not been able to talk about it until now. Subscribe right now, because what happened in that delivery room and what Benny said when he finally spoke and what Hailey did when she found out I had been in that hospital is the story that broke everything open. I'm Justin, and I was never supposed to be in that room, and I was, and the baby was in my arms, and Benny was in the doorway, and I still don't fully understand how any of it happened. Let me take you back, not to the hospital, to 3 days before it, because the delivery room was not the beginning of this story. The beginning was a phone call from Selena at 2 a.m. that I answered because I could not sleep, and my phone was on the nightstand and her name was on the screen. And some instinct that I have learned not to question made me pick it up. She said, "Something is happening." She said it simply, no drama, no build. Just those 3 words, and then silence while she waited for me to understand what she meant. I said, "How far apart?" She said, 7 minutes. She said, "Benny is not here." She said, "I've called him 4 times. She said her voice was doing the thing it does when she is trying to stay calm, and the effort of staying calm is visible in every syllable. I said, "Where is he?" She said, "I don't know." She said, "I don't know, and the contractions are 7 minutes apart, and I don't know." I sat up in bed. The room was dark. Hailey was asleep beside me. I looked at the time on my phone, 2:17 in the morning. I said, "I'm coming." She said, "Justin, you don't have to." I said, "I'm coming. Stay on the phone." I got out of bed. I got dressed in the dark, moving quietly, the specific, careful choreography of trying not to wake someone. I wrote nothing on the nightstand this time. I left nothing. I just went. Because there was no version of the next 10 minutes that allowed for the conversation I would have needed to have, and because Selena was on the phone with contractions 7 minutes apart and Benny was not answering, I drove. She stayed on the phone. I could hear her breathing through the contractions, and I talked to her about nothing, about the road and the traffic lights and whatever small thing my mouth could produce, because silence during a contraction is worse than noise, and she needed something to hold on to. We got to the hospital at 2:41. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock when I pulled into the emergency bay and thought, this is a time I will remember. Her team was already there. 2 people from her staff who had clearly been called before me and had arrived before me, and who looked at me when I came through the door with expressions that contained several things at once. Surprise, relief, the specific calculation of someone who is managing a situation and has just had a variable change. They got her into a room quickly. I stayed in the corridor. I was not supposed to be in that room. I understood that. She had a medical team and her staff, and I was a person who had driven across the city at 2 a.m. because she had called and Benny had not answered, and I did not know what my role was supposed to be now that I was here. I called Benny. It went to voicemail. I called again, voicemail. I sat in a chair in that corridor and I waited. One of her staff members came out periodically and gave me updates in the careful way of someone who is not sure what information I was entitled to. Progressing normally, moving quickly, doing well. At some point, maybe an hour in, the staff member came out and said, "She's asking for you." I said, "For me?" She said, "Yes." I said, Is that appropriate?" I said it the way you say something when you are trying to understand the rules of a situation that has no clear rules. She said, "She's asking for you." That's what I know. I went in. The room was the specific controlled chaos of a delivery in progress. Monitors and lights and the medical team moving with the efficiency of people who do this regularly. Selena was on the bed and she was in the middle of something enormous, and she looked at me when I came in and something in her face shifted. She said, "You came?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Benny's not here." I said, "I know. I'm here." She said, "Stay." I said, "I'm not going anywhere. What happened in the next 2 hours is not mine to describe in detail. That time belongs to her. What I will tell you is that I was there, in the room, not as anything I had a name for, just as a person who had driven across the city at 2 a.m. because someone needed someone and I was the someone who came. At 4:53 in the morning, a baby came into the world. The room changed the way rooms change in that moment. something that is not describable in any language I have. The specific shift of a space when it contains one more person than it did a second ago. The doctor lifted the baby. She did the things doctors do in those first seconds. And then she turned toward the room to hand the baby to someone. Selena's hands were occupied. Her team was occupied. There was a procedural moment, brief, where the doctor needed someone to hold the baby for exactly the seconds it took to complete what she was doing. She turned toward me. She held the baby out. I took her. Comment below right now. I need you to tell me something. If you were standing in that room in my position, what would you have done? Would you have stepped forward? Would you have stepped back? Would you have said something? Tell me where you're watching from, because that moment, the moment the doctor turned toward me, is the moment I replay the most. I held her. I don't know how long. Seconds, maybe less. The specific eternity of a handful of seconds when something is in your arms that has just arrived in the world and is real in a way that nothing else in the room is real. And then the door opened. Benny walked in. He was out of breath. His jacket was on wrong, one collar up, the way clothes go when you have put them on in a hurry in the dark. He had clearly been moving fast. He came through the door and he stopped. He saw me. He saw the baby. He saw Selena on the bed. He stood in that doorway and he took in the room and nobody said anything. The medical team continued doing what they were doing with the specific professional focus of people who have seen complicated human situations in delivery rooms before and whose job is to not make them more complicated. Selena said, Benny. He did not look at her. He was looking at me and at the baby in my arms. I held the baby out toward him, not dramatically, not as a statement, just the obvious thing. The baby needed to be with him. I held her out. He did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the room. He took the baby. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that I have been trying to name ever since. Not the expression of a father holding his child for the first time. Something more complicated and harder to read. He looked at me over the baby's head. He said one thing, one sentence, and then he turned to Selena and he did not look at me again for the rest of the time I was in that room. I left about 20 minutes later. I walked through the hospital. I walked out into the parking lot. The morning had arrived while I was inside. The sun was coming up over the buildings and the air had the specific quality of very early morning in a city that has been awake all night. I sat in my car. I called Hailey. She answered on the second ring. She was awake. She said, where are you? I said, I'm in a hospital parking lot. She said, are you okay? I said, yes. I said, I need to tell you something. I said, I need to tell you where I've been and what happened and all of it. I said, I'm not going to tell you part of it. I'm going to tell you all of it. She said, then come home and tell me. I said, okay. I drove home. Hailey was in the kitchen when I came in. She had made coffee. There were 2 cups. She sat down and I sat down and I told her everything. The phone call at 2:17, the drive, the corridor, the room, the doctor turning toward me with the baby, Benny in the doorway, and the one thing Benny said. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what did he say? I told her. She was quiet for a longer moment. Then she said, he said that because he was scared. I said, I know. She said, he said it because you were holding his baby and he did not know how to be in that room with both of those things happening at once. I said, I know. She said, that doesn't make it okay. I said, no, it doesn't. She said, but it makes it human. I sat with that. She said, how is she? I said, she's okay. The baby is okay. She said, everyone is okay. She said, good. She looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, you should have woken me up. I said, I know. She said, I would have come with you. I looked at her. She said, next time something like this happens, wake me up. She said, I don't want to find out from a parking lot phone call. She said, I want to be there. Whatever that looks like, I want to be there. I said, okay. She said, promise me. I said, I promise. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. I drank mine. The morning light was coming through the kitchen windows and the city was waking up outside, and somewhere across town, Selena was in a hospital room with a baby who was 4 hours old, and Benny was sitting in a chair beside the bed, and the one thing he had said was still sitting in the room where he had said it. What Benny said, what it meant, and what happened in the week that followed when the full picture of where I had been that night became public is the beginning of part 2. Because what happened when the story got out was not what any of us anticipated. And what Hailey did when it happened is the moment I understood that waking her up and bringing her into it would always be the right choice. Not because it is easier, because she is better at this than I am. And two people handling something together is always stronger than one person handling it alone. Subscribe right now, press the bell, because part 2 starts with the story getting out and with Benny making a decision about what to do with the one thing he said in that delivery room. And that decision is the most unexpected thing in this entire story. Stay with me. I want to tell you about the one thing Benny said. I have been deciding whether to include it in this video, not because I want to be dramatic about withholding it, because the one thing he said belongs to a moment that is not fully mine to describe, and I want to give it the space it deserves rather than dropping it into the middle of everything else. But I think you need to understand the shape of it, even if I don't give you the specific words, because the shape of it is what explains what happened in the week that followed. It was not a threat. It was not anger in the way anger usually presents. It was a question, a single question said very quietly in the specific tone of someone who has walked into a room and found something they were not prepared for and is trying to understand what they are looking at before they decide how to feel about it. The question was about me and Selena, about the nature of what we were to each other, about whether what he was seeing in that delivery room, me with his child in my arms, was something that had a history he didn't know about. And the question, the specific question he asked, was one that I could not answer with a simple yes or no, not because the answer was complicated in the way he might have feared, but because the answer required a history that would have taken longer than the delivery room could hold. I said nothing. And my saying nothing was its own answer, not the answer he feared, but an answer that required explanation. And the explanation required a conversation that was not going to happen in that room at 4:53 in the morning with the baby in my arms and the medical team still present. So I said nothing, and I handed him the baby, and I left. And in the week that followed, Benny made a decision about what to do with the question I had not answered. He made that decision without talking to me first, without talking to Selena. He made it with the incomplete information he had and the specific fear that incomplete information produces. And the decision he made is the reason part 2 exists. What he did, who he told, and what that person did with what he told them. That is where part 2 begins. I want to say one more thing about that morning, about the drive home and the 2 cups of coffee and Hailey saying, "I would have come with you." I have been thinking about those words ever since. I would have come with you, said simply, without drama, without accusation, just as a fact about who she is and what she would have done. She would have come in the middle of the night to a hospital to sit in a corridor while her husband was in a delivery room with his ex-girlfriend. She would have come because that is what she does. She shows up for the hard things. She has always shown up for the hard things. The question has always been whether I let her. That morning in the kitchen, with the 2 cups of coffee and the morning light and the full story laid out between us, I made a decision. I am going to let her. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but I'm going to stop deciding what she can handle and start trusting that she can handle whatever is true. I am going to wake her up the next time. I'm going to bring her into the corridor, the parking lot, the kitchen table, all of it, instead of arriving afterward with the phone call from the car. She said she would have come with me. I believe her. And the next time something happens, whatever that something is, she will not have to find out from a parking lot phone call. She will be there when it happens, because I will wake her up, because she is the person I trust with the full truth of my life, because that is what marriage is, not protection, trust. Part 2 starts with what Benny did with his question, with who he told and what they did, and with the morning 3 days later when Hailey and I woke up and found out together what had happened while we were sleeping. Finding out together, that is already different from everything that came before it. Subscribe, press the bell. Part 2 is coming. And this time, when something happens, we are both in the room. Stay with me. There is something else about that delivery room that I have not told you yet. Something that happened in the seconds between the doctor turning toward me and Benny walking through the door. When I was holding the baby, in those seconds before everything else arrived, I looked at her. Not at Selena, not at the door, at the baby. She was the specific kind of new that newborns are. the specific aliveness of a person who has been in the world for less than a minute. She was making the sounds that newborns make. Her hands were doing what newborn hands do. She smelled the way newborns smell. And I looked at her and I felt something that I was not expecting to feel, something that was not complicated, something that had nothing to do with the history in the room or the absence of Benny or any of the things that the situation contained, something simple and enormous and very old. I felt the weight of her, not literally. Newborns do not weigh much. The specific weight, I mean, is different. The weight of a new person, the weight of someone who has just arrived and who is going to need everything from the world and from the people in it, the weight of potential, the weight of someone who does not yet know what they are going to be. I held that weight for those seconds. And then the door opened and Benny was there and the room became what it became. And I handed her over because she was his to hold, not mine. And I stepped back and I became a person standing in a corner of a room watching a father hold his daughter for the first time. His face when he held her, even with everything that had just happened, even with me in the room and the question sitting in the air, his face when he held her was something I was not prepared for. The specific softening that happened, the way all the complicated things fell away for a moment and there was just him and her. That is what I keep coming back to, not the question, not the one thing he said after, his face when he held his daughter. It reminded me of something I carry, something that is the center of my life in a way that everything else orbits. I have a son, he is not quite 2 years old, and the weight of him, the specific weight I described, is something I feel every day. Not literally the weight of his existence, of his not yet knowing what he is going to be, of his needing everything from the world and from me specifically. I drove home from that hospital at 5:30 in the morning with the weight of 2 children sitting in my chest. My son at home asleep. Selena's daughter just arrived, both of them new, both of them needing everything. And the specific awareness of what it means to be a parent, not theoretically. In the real and daily and exhausting and extraordinary practice of it, what it means to be the person a new human needs. I thought about this on the drive home, about what the delivery room had reminded me, about what watching Benny hold his daughter, even through the complicated lens of that specific moment, had clarified. I want to be present, not performing presence, actually present, in the room, awake. There when things happen instead of arriving afterward with phone calls from parking lots. That is what the morning had cost me the clarity to understand. Hailey said I would have come with you. She would have sat in that corridor at 3 in the morning with a cup of bad hospital coffee, and she would have been there when I came out, and she would have driven home with me in the dawn, and we would have had the kitchen table conversation together instead of me arriving alone with a story to tell. She would have come. Next time she will, because I am going to wake her up. Because presence is not something you perform. It is something you practice. And the practice starts with not leaving notes on nightstands and not making decisions alone about what someone else can handle and not arriving afterward with the phone call from the car. The practice starts with waking her up. What Benny did with his question in the days that followed, the person he told, what that person did, and the morning Hailey and I woke up together to find out what had happened overnight. That is part 2. And it is the first part of this story where we face something together from the beginning instead of me facing it first and bringing it to her after. That difference, that small, enormous difference, is what everything I have been trying to learn has been building towards. Subscribe right now, press the bell. Part 2 is coming, and it starts with the both of us in the room. Stay with me. There is one more thing I want to say about Selena in that room. After Benny came in and I handed him the baby and the room became what it became, I stayed for about 20 minutes. I stayed because leaving immediately would have been its own statement, because the room had a specific tension that my leaving would have made worse. Because Selena had asked me to stay and I had said I was not going anywhere, and even though the geography of the room had changed completely, I did not want to be the person who said I was not going anywhere and then went. So I stayed, I stood in a corner, I was as small as I could make myself. I watched Benny with the baby. I watched Selena watching Benny with the baby. I watched the medical team finish what they needed to finish. I watched the room settle into the specific quiet of after. At some point, Selena looked at me across the room. Benny had his back to me. She looked at me the way she looks at me when she is trying to say something without saying it, the specific look that has its own language. She mouthed something, 2 words. Thank you. I nodded. And then I left. I left because it was time to leave and because Benny and Selena and their daughter needed the room without me in it. I left because whatever my role had been in the previous few hours was complete and the next thing was theirs. I walked through the hospital, out to the parking lot, into the dawn, and I called Hailey. The call from the parking lot, the drive home, the kitchen table, the 2 cups of coffee, the full story. All of it is the version of things I am trying to become. Not arriving afterward with the phone call. Arriving afterward with the phone call is already better than the note on the nightstand. But it is not yet the thing I am working toward, which is waking her up and bringing her into it from the beginning. I am not there yet, but I am closer. 2 cups of coffee on a kitchen table at 6 in the morning while you tell the full truth to the person who would have come with you. That is closer. What Benny decided to do with his question. The week that followed. The morning Hailey and I woke up to find out together what had happened while we were sleeping. And the first time in this entire story that we face something from the beginning, rather than me facing it first and her catching up, that is part 2, and it begins with both of us in the room. Subscribe right now, bell icon. I will see you in part 2. Whatever comes next, we are facing it together. Stay with me. For anyone watching this who has ever received a phone call in the middle of the night from someone who needed someone and gone, for anyone who has ever stood in a corner of a room trying to take up as little space as possible, for anyone who has ever driven home in the dawn with the weight of something sitting in their chest that they did not know how to carry, you are not alone in that. Those are the moments that reveal something, not about the person who called or the room you were in or the complicated history that put you there, about you, about what kind of person you are when someone calls at 2 in the morning and needs someone to come. I would go again, not because it was clean or simple or without cost, because she called and Benny was not answering and someone needed someone and I was the someone who came. That is the version of myself I am trying to be in all of it. Not the version that leaves notes on nightstands and manages things alone and arrives afterward with the parking lot phone call. The version that goes and then comes home and tells the full truth to the person who would have come with me, one version at a time, one conversation at a time, 1 cup of coffee at a time. Part 2 is coming. Subscribe, press the bell, stay with me. And for Hailey, who said I would have come with you, who meant it, who will come next time, because I am going to wake her up. I see you. I am trying every day to be worthy of you. And next time something happens at 2 in the morning, you will not find out from a parking lot phone call. You will be there because I am going to wake you up. That is the promise I am keeping. Not saying it, doing it. Subscribe. Stay with me. Part 2 is where we do it together. For the first time in all of these stories, together. From the beginning. Both of us in the room. I will see you there. One thing I forgot to tell you about the drive to the hospital at 2:41 in the morning. About 10 minutes in, while Selena was still on the phone and I was talking about nothing to give her something to hold on to through the contractions, she said something between 2 of them that I have been thinking about ever since. She said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "I keep thinking that when this is over and the baby is here, none of this will have mattered." She said all the complicated stuff, the history and the distance and everything that is hard about us being in each other's lives. She said none of it is going to matter when there is a baby in the room. She said a baby makes everything else very small. I said, yes, I think that's right. She said, I just want her to be okay. She said, that's the only thing I want right now, just for her to be okay. I said, she's going to be okay. I said, you're going to be okay. I said, just keep breathing. She said, okay. And she did. She kept breathing. And the baby came. And when the baby was in the room, everything else became very small, the way Selena had said it would. Even the question Benny asked, even the one thing he said, even the complicated history and the delivery room and all of it, very small compared to the fact of a new person. That is what I carried home in the dawn alongside everything else, the specific smallness that a new life produces in everything that surrounds it. The reminder that most of the things we treat as enormous are actually very manageable when something genuinely enormous arrives. The baby is okay. Selena is okay. The baby made everything else very small. And I drove home and I told Hailey the full truth, and we drank coffee as the morning arrived, and part 2 is what came after. Subscribe. Bell icon. Stay with me. I will see you there. What Benny said. What he did with it. What the week that followed looked like. In the morning, Hailey and I woke up together to find out what had happened while we were sleeping. That is part 2. Subscribe right now and press that bell so you are there when it arrives. Stay with me.